Get started. Hello, everybody. A very pleasant good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of BHBA Family Law Presents Direct Examination with Dan and Lauren. Along with Lauren Youngman from Youngman Reichstein, I'm Dan Bemmel, financial advisor and certified divorce financial analyst. During each episode of our show, we explore our guest's personal and professional history and dig into meaningful legal topics. Again, Lauren is out today, so we're joined by our superstar, rock star guest host, Samantha Klein. Sam is the head of the California family law practice at Withers, and we love having her here. Please continue to join us for our upcoming episodes, always at 12:30 p.m. live on Zoom. Grace Jammer and Michael Hanasab on June 7th, Aaron Gray and Chelsea Stevens on July 5th, Judge Harvey A. Silberman on August 2nd, and we'll be announcing the rest of this year's schedule soon. Sam.
Welcome to Stacy Phillips. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping announcements. You will receive your MCLE certificate shortly after the program. Please take a moment to complete the survey that is included with your certificate. This program will be available in a couple of days, so you can relive the Stacy interview, which I can assure you will be fantastic, on Beverly Hills Bar Association On Demand and BHBA's newest member benefit, presented by Lawyers Mutual Insurance Company. The family law section is sponsored by White Zuckerman, Warshawski, Luna, and Hunt. White Zuckerman, Warshawski, Luna, and Hunt provides a wide variety of resources to complete almost any project, large or small. They also provide traditional accounting and tax practice services. We invite you to contact them to discuss your specific accounting needs and learn how they can be of service to you.
All right. Well, we know why we're all here. We're so glad to welcome Stacy to the show. Stacy's list of honors and achievements run pages long. Just trying to go through it. It's just too much. She's long been recognized as one of the top practitioners in the field for decades, really. Published and cited countless times. She's the author of an amazing book on the psychological aspects of divorce, and beyond the practice is deeply committed to philanthropy. Stacy's currently a partner at Blank Rome on the board of directors of Public Counsel, and she's done so much. I'm afraid we're barely going to scratch the surface today. We've been looking forward to this interview for a long time. So first and most importantly, Stacy, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. This is really wonderful.
All right, let's jump in. We got a lot to get to, and let's start by picking up on part of last month's conversation that Sam and I had with Judge Gordon. I want to put a little different twist on it and focus on some of the biggest changes in both the law and in the practice of law since you started. How has communication and technology changed your business?
Well, I remember the day when we started with fax machines, and somebody I knew said, "You will rue the day," because they expected a much quicker response. Now with texts and emails, people expect an instantaneous response. And what's the most important thing that we should be doing? Thinking, reflecting, responding, not reacting. And there's a tendency when you get a text or an email, you fire it off and you haven't had a chance to reflect or think. And sometimes you say to yourself, "I wish I hadn't sent it." So even though we're all compelled and there's an expectation and a pressure to respond, anybody out there listening, step back, think, take some time before you just fire off your words. But there's a lot of pressure.
Do you think the relationship between attorneys suffers for that also?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have you can't even see my fingers. They're going as I'm pretending to be on my phone texting somebody, whether it's a lawyer or a client. I'd like to think with a judge, you take a little slower, but absolutely. And there are forms of conversations that really should be slowed down and thought about.
You know, I remember when I started practicing law, we used the fax and we used mail. I remember getting mail and being like, "Oh my God, somebody sent me a letter," right? And thinking I had plenty of time to respond. With technology, do you think there's anything positive that it has done to our practice?
Yes, because sometimes in the past, and let me just step aside for a second. Sam, it is really great to be here with you. I remember when you started practicing law, I was right there next to you. My firm and your firm shared space, and it just gives me great pride and pleasure. I have tears in my eyes watching what you have become and grown into. With that said, as we've grown up together, although I am older, there is a benefit of moving things more quickly, because when we would get a letter before, it would have to go through snail mail, and maybe you would get a FedEx or delivery, and you sometimes had too much time to respond. And it was really hard on people, and it made things maybe take longer, sort of mañana. But there's a downside to speed too. And again, my message here is we need to think, we need to reflect, we need to respond, not react.
So another thing that's changed a lot since you first started are the disclosure rules. How has that changed your practice and really how you interact with your clients?
So I actually remember when we were discussing the disclosure rules before Jackie Spires sent it through our government up in Sacramento, and we were all a little intimidated. Oh my God, this is what we have to do. But like any other change, it becomes part of the fabric. The good news is it's part of disclose, 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 which is you're supposed to share information. You're supposed to be transparent. I still have an issue with many of our colleagues who think you have to ask for information. No, our rules are you're supposed to give, you're supposed to be transparent. And these disclosure statements start that process. What's intimidating about them is certainly for the final, you're expected to value assets, and sometimes assets are really hard to value, or there are different ways of valuing them. Do you value them at cost? You value them at fair market value. If you do it wrong, not that you as a lawyer would do it, but if you provide the wrong information, even though it's the right methodology, then your client could be held accountable later, comes back to the accountants and the lawyers. So there's a lot of pressure. I keep using this word pressure, but I think it's all good that it encourages full disclosure. God bless.
I find that one of the challenges is when there are assets that are international, there's cross-border issues with properties, disclosing those adequately, particularly when you're doing a preliminary declaration of disclosure at the beginning of the case. Do you find that as well?
Absolutely. And given your firm is England based, I'm sure you deal with that maybe even more than others of us who, yes, absolutely. And outside the United States, they don't pay taxes. So how do you disclose income and what does it really mean? And what's an income in a foreign country where you could live, with housekeepers and butlers and private jets and private yachts, and what you show is income because you have lots of trusts that pay for it. I mean, how do you disclose that in the proper way so the information, for example, to determine spousal support or to determine child support is clear, as opposed to hiding behind the rules elsewhere?
So how do you do it? What's the answer?
Well, since I'm in the middle of a case like that right now, I think there's an obligation to fully disclose, to share the information that would allow our courts to make determinations. What is the equivalent of it? How were expenses paid? Don't just say expenses are paid by others. What expenses are paid by? How much are they? You have multiple homes and multiple boats. Okay, don't act like you make, less than a first-year associate at a law firm. That's not being transparent.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, but I'm going to switch gears a little bit here. And I want to talk to you a little bit about domestic violence. There have been changes in the law of domestic violence over the course of many years. Do you think that the changes are positive, or do you have any feelings about the expansion of the law in that area?
So let me just give you a little bit of background. I was one of the authors of a bill that expanded the time for a statute of limitations to sue your domestic violence abuser. And when I was part of this bill, it was before OJ, and we couldn't get much traction in Sacramento. And then OJ happened, and we got traction. And eventually the bill was passed, not quite the way we designed it. And I remember one of the senators saying to me when we were testifying, I was the victim of domestic violence and I got it together over a year. Why do you need more than that? I knew at lunchtime I shouldn't be lobbying her. I was going to lobby other senators. Over time, I've watched its expansion from truly physical violence to words, and often words are more powerful than physicality, than emails and texts, and then posting things. And now it's expanded to coercive control, including financial control. I absolutely agree that the expansions are warranted, although the definition of interfering with one's emotional calm, somebody can curse at you and that will upset your emotional calm. It certainly does to me. I don't think on a one-off that should be grounds for domestic violence, but that's all part of the new fabric. And I think in family law, we have caught a wider berth than in civil for restraining orders, and judges are sort of trying to figure it out. And some judges innately, with their innate bias, and that's not a criticism, still think that you really need to have physicality, but that's not where the law is now. And I think before anything finds its equilibrium, it goes to different extremes until you sort of find the right way in the middle.
Just to touch on what you raised, which is bias and the role of bias in domestic violence restraining orders. There are the group of people who believe that once a temporary order is issued, your fate is sealed. There are other people who do not believe that and believe that judges are able to put aside any bias that they may have and render decisions. Where do you fall on that?
In my experience, it's not really my judgment. My experience with judges are most are more willing to grant a temporary than a permanent. But I've had ample experience with not getting a temporary and getting a permanent, with a judge being really hard in the delivery of the message to the perpetrator. So I think it depends on the judges. I've gotten restraining orders that I thought were on the border, and I've not received restraining orders on a temporary basis that I thought were a slam dunk. On a permanent basis, it is not game over if you get it or don't get it on a temporary basis, especially if you're in front of a different judicial officer, which just shows my point from before. Different judges view domestic violence differently.
Where would you take the law now? You talked about lobbying and advocating for changes before. If you were going to do that again, how would you reform the code as it sits?
Well, the statute that I was involved in involved the statute of limitations to sue your abuser. I like the way the law has developed now, but I don't like where it can be misused. And I think we are all trying to figure out what the proper path is. Again, a one-off calling somebody a name, to me, that's what people do in real life. But somebody who uses foul names in front of children on a regular basis and sends them emails. And I remember coming through a trial in 2020, and one of my partners saying to me, I never had to use the C word again, because that word was involved in many texts and emails. And that's where the ultimate 5-year domestic violence restraining order issued, because they were vituperative and awful. Just you shook when you read these things. And again, it wasn't a one-off. And when I gave the closing argument, I had to use these words, which are an anathema to me. So I think judges need to really reflect. And it's not just physical, and it's not to the extreme in my book of a one-off cursing at somebody.
So your answers come obviously not just from the practitioner perspective, but from your own experience. And I know you haven't really talked about this publicly much, but I want to talk a little bit about your own experience and lessons from you going through your divorces and those, what you learned in those relationships. Just broadly speaking, did going through divorce yourself change how you approach cases?
Absolutely. Sadly, I've been divorced twice. If you saw me with the father of my children, you would think we were happily married to each other. I love him. I love his wife. We are a family. We do things together. And yet there was one day I remember that something happened and it really threw me off, and I left work early, which I don't do. And I was driving and I had to pull over. I had no clue where I was. this is where I normally drive. And I looked around like, where am I? And it made me realize that clients who are going through a divorce, they are in a fugue state. And yet we expect them to make their most important decisions of their lives. And yet they're really not in a position to do that. And I thought, I'm a divorce lawyer. This is my playground. And I pull over to the side of the road because I don't know where I am. Oh my God, that's what my clients are going through in spades. I did not have the same experience with my second husband, who sadly was an alcoholic and is deceased. So I learned an awful lot from that one. I have a saying that good judgment comes from experience, most of it bad. And that one taught me a lot.
When did you know in your second marriage that something wasn't quite right?
Before we got married. And I thought we dealt with it, and he got help, and I thought he was an incredibly accomplished, nationally known trial lawyer, partner in a big firm, really well respected. So it didn't occur to me that if he put his mind to something, he couldn't achieve it. And the 2 months before we got married, he was in another state preparing to go to trial 3 days after our wedding. So I didn't realize he had resumed drinking. He was an alcoholic, and then he left the next morning. So it took a while after the fact for me to realize that the problem was not solved, and it became a bigger problem. And it
So
got solved and unsolved.
When did that perception start to change? What led you to that realization?
After we got married, that things were not right.
Mm-hmm.
On our honeymoon, a few months later, when we were on the plane, figured out he was going through withdrawal, however many gazillion feet up, flying to Australia. And ultimately, not then, but he had a seizure. I can only imagine if he had a seizure while we were on the airplane. It went through 7 withdrawals, hospitalization, Betty Ford, the whole 9 yards. And it's made me a better lawyer. I understand the process much better. I understand clients who are either the addict or the alcoholic themselves, or the victim of. And my intuition before, and most judges' intuition, and most people's intuition, are just backwards. The common line, and I've had judges say to my clients in a hearing, why didn't you leave him? That my response ultimately to them was, look at me, I'm smart. I didn't. That's not what you do until you've gone through it many times. So you can't say that to somebody. You can't have your innate bias judge somebody and say, why don't you protect yourself? You think you are protecting yourself and your children, certainly your children first, when you're just dead bang wrong.
When clients come into your office and they are alleging that their spouse has some sort of substance abuse issue, how do you judge not judge is the bad way of putting it. How do you assess, I know, right? How do you assess whether or not there is actually a substance abuse issue, or if it's a spouse alleging something to gain some sort of advantage in a case? What do you look for?
And by the way, if I thought I had a client who was making something up for a litigation advantage, they would no longer be my client. That's number one. I ask a lot of questions, and from experience, I can evaluate better than people who haven't had that experience. Remember, good judgment comes from experience, most of it bad. I have this experience. I also work with some terrific experts, addiction specialists, custody experts, so that it's not my own issue, that I have a place and somebody to challenge me. And many people who are the quote unquote victim of a spouse who is an alcoholic or an addict, it takes a while to actually pull it out of them. I mean, here it is for me 11 years later, and I'm finally talking about it. And for a reason, because if I can help one person, then it's sort of worth it. Not sort of, it is worth it. but it's taken me this long.
You mentioned before your children and the importance of protecting your children. How did you explain things to them at the time, and how has that changed now that it has been, a decade since?
Well, there's some explaining and then there's some experience. So let me tell you about the explaining. After my former husband was in the hospital after having a seizure, I sat down with my 2 kids and 3 of my godchildren. And most children think nothing's going to happen to me. And I said to them, you have seen where drinking too much leads. You have choices in your life. You can drink, you can do drugs, and you may think, oh, it will never happen to me. But you saw how it happened. So I am asking that you really reflect on the choices that you make. I can't do it for you. I can't be there to protect you. You're going to make your own choices. But you have seen this play out. Oh, I also sat down with my 2 nephews. And you have seen this happen. Please reflect on it. So that was sort of the guidance. The experience, we talked, but when your kids are young, what they understand and how they communicate are not at the level that an adult would. I literally last weekend had a discussion with my daughter. And as she said, she was a complete brat dealing with her stepfather. And she said, and she told me this now, I didn't understand it then, that she did it intentionally because she didn't have the words to be able to say, this is not right. He's doing things, I see it. And so adults were challenging her. Oh, you only are upset and you're acting this way because your mom is putting her attention not just on you and your brother, but there's somebody else. And that wasn't the case. And she felt very frustrated because she was like screaming in the wind and nobody heard her. And we've had long talks about that. And I take responsibility for that. It was my choices, my actions, and I didn't protect her enough. She was the one who was really at home. And it has greatly affected her. Try to be honest with my kids, but she was too young to be able to articulate what she understood, saw, and felt. And she was right.
Looking back, what role did your friends and your family play in supporting you through this process and through your marriage, which from the beginning, there were substance abuse issues there?
Thank you for actually asking that. When my former husband had a seizure and was hospitalized, I sat down with my family and my close friends, and I asked them questions. And like my father and my kids said, oh, I could smell it on his breath on a weekend. And like, why didn't you say something to me? So I begged them, if you see this in the future, please tell me. A bunch of months later, my father sat me down and said, you made us promise. We think he's drinking again. I said, you're right. I have observed it. I'm dealing with it. Thank you. But in retrospect, and I do not blame my family or friends. And one of the reasons I'm talking about this now is I truly believe that there is a better solution, a better plan for most people who are living with an alcoholic or an addict, and which is you try to get the addict or the alcoholic help. You do an intervention once, maybe twice. Then you focus on the spouse or partner, personal partner, or maybe even a law partner or business partner. But if your friends and family are seeing things and you are not, you can't, it's being held from you, or you are incapable of seeing it, or it's there and you don't want to see it. If they sit down with you, not one person, I'm a great example. One person comes up to me, I'll run ramshot over that person. But if it's a group of people, I know for me, I would have pushed back, and then I would have thought about it, and then I would have spurred into action. My daughter told me the other day, what was upsetting to her is she knew that if I thought she was in danger, I would have gone into action immediately. And she didn't understand why I didn't understand that she was in danger. So, and if you can't get your friends and family to rally because they're afraid, you got to do it for yourself. So word out there, if you are living with somebody or close to somebody who is an alcoholic or an addict, and you don't know what to do, set a meeting with your friends and family. And if you invite the commentary, oh, they will give it to you, but they may be too scared to start it themselves.
You touched on the availability and the usefulness, really, of providing support to partners, right? And presumably you also need family members and children of the addict. Is there enough being done to support that group of people, or is it really the focus too much on the addict and the addictive behavior in the first place?
So if you go to a place like Betty Ford, which is an excellent place, for the outpatient, they help them find a therapist, tell them to go to AA or the equivalent. They do nothing to help a joint therapist for the couple or the family. They don't teach you how to figure out reentry. And there's, to my understanding and my research, nothing to help the spouse or partner, which is why I am espousing what I call the 2+1 intervention. The 2 is to the addict or alcoholic. The 1 is to the spouse or partner. And the focus needs to also be on that true victim and the family. It's not a choice that they've made other than to be with this person and maybe to get out. Alcoholism addiction is an illness. And either that person tries to deal with it, may have slip-ups, but makes an effort. But if that person is either not making an effort or completely incapable of succeeding, then you got to rescue the others. And I challenge you, go online. It's not there.
You touched on how close you are, your father, and how he came to talk to him about this issue. I don't think that everybody on this podcast, I want to say Zoom podcast, knows who your father is and how close a relationship you had. Can you just touch on that briefly for us?
Sure. As folks in my former law firm used to say, he was known as Law Dad. My dad was Jerry Phillips. He was a partner at Phillips Nizer in New York, founded by my grandfather, and an executive at United Artists. And when I decided to move out here, and my brother decided to move out here, I convinced my parents to move, which was harder than going to court. But it enabled us to live near each other. Eventually, my father had an office in my office. I got to see him every day, help raise my kids. And my dad was a wonderful man, and my mom was the power behind the throne.
When you, in that period, when you were coming out of that second divorce, you at that point, you had the support you needed. Did it change your practice? Did the nature of your practice or the type of cases that you were taking change?
Nothing changed by my efforts, but I believe in God, and I think the God or the universe or somebody was helping me share what I had learned and work through whatever I had gone through. Because in the 2-3 years after my former husband and I split up, I had more alcohol, drug, and domestic violence, which all goes hand in hand, cases than I had ever had before in my entire 30+ year career at that point. And I was able to work on those cases and help the clients in a vastly different way than I would have if I had not had this personal experience. And I know I made a difference.
So what do you want attorneys who maybe haven't had that experience, that personal experience, what are the most important things that they can be focused on either side? If they have the addict or the alcoholic, maybe that's a different set of things they should be doing. Or you talked a lot about general support, but from a case standpoint, what should people be looking for specifically?
Don't judge, because if you have an innate bias, you are likely to be very wrong. Take what they say seriously, but you got to tease it out. It could be months. And then your natural reaction, certainly judges' reactions, like, oh, why are you saying this now 6 months later? It must be retaliatory. Because it is hard to relive experience. You put it in a box on the shelf. It's hard to be honest with yourself that you allowed certain things to happen. I mean, I reflect on what happened in my household and look at it and go, what was I thinking? That I could protect myself and my family? I was nuts. But while I was going through it, I'm a solver, I'm a fixer, I'm a protector, I can do it all. But I was wrong. And for lawyers, you can look at a client and say, why didn't you leave? What were you thinking? Somebody's walking around with a gun in your house or a gun at the front door? I mean, really? You can't judge. Work with experts who actually understand addiction and custody, make sure that they don't have too much of an innate bias. And anybody's free to call me. I am happy to share my experience. Again, good judgment comes from experience, most of it bad.
So let's roll back the clock a little bit. And I want to shift gears and learn a little bit more about your career trajectory from the very beginning. So when we talked about your dad a little bit, let's unpack that a little bit more. When did you first start thinking about becoming an attorney?
Well, when I was growing up, what could women do? They could be a secretary, they could be a nurse, they could be a teacher. My mother was a buyer and then a travel agent, so I knew what that was. Yeah, they could be a doctor. I had a pediatrician who was a woman. My brother and I hated her. She's very cold. But she could handle my mom, as my mother described it. And I could be a lawyer. I didn't want to be a doctor because needles freak me out. And I had lots of role models who were lawyers, including in my grandfather's firm, some very, very powerful women. So that's what I saw. But I am not one to just sort of trot along. I had to push back and prove to myself that I wasn't going to be a lawyer just because it was sort of expected or natural. So I worked in a couple of law firms. I worked for the federal government. I worked for the New York City government. And I decided that, this was something that I really resonated with. But again, I didn't have that many choices. Today, kids have so many other opportunities. And if I had to do it all over again, if I wasn't a lawyer, I'd probably be a psychologist, which is what Sam and I do for a living. So,
yeah, that's so clear. So if it wasn't quite destiny, if it was half destiny in a way, once you decide to really pursue it, did it change your relationship with your dad?
Well, I'm remembering when I first started at Columbia Law School, I was living at home until we got me an apartment that ended up being across the street from the law school. So every night at dinner, my dad and I would talk about what I was learning in school that day. And my mom was at her wit's end. She was so bored after a few days. First, she thought it was sort of cute. And then I could tell, okay, you could be gone. So yes, I could talk to my dad at a different level, but I had always talked to him about that because that was my father. He would literally sit when we were growing up with the World Book Dictionary and teach us words. And my mother would say, leave them alone. But I loved it. I had friends over. He would do like spelling tests at the dinner table, but I wanted to please my dad. And to me, that was fun. It was a game. I didn't feel pressure. He taught me how to add by playing blackjack. He taught me how to spell by doing crossword puzzles. It was fun and it was with my dad. So how could it be bad? So yes, we had a certain dialogue and my brother ended up being a movie producer, which is sort of the other half of my dad's family. So my dad was able to converse with my brother and with me at a level that made my mom jealous. Of course, I had things to talk about with her. She was a buyer. Clothes were a big thing.
You talked about being a psychologist and the role of psychology, touched on it kind of for a second there. Was being a psychologist ever really on the table for you? Did you consider that at the time, or is that something looking in retrospect that seems like an area that may have suited you well?
When I was growing up, what I knew about were social workers and psychiatrists. I didn't fully appreciate what a psychologist was. Well, I didn't want to be a medical doctor, and social workers, the way I saw them working did not resonate with me. And it wasn't until I was really in law school or practicing, and I thought at one point of stopping and going back and getting a PhD, and I thought, oh my God, I'm in my 20s, 30s. Another 7 years of school. I don't think so. And as I spent more years practicing law and I could craft it more myself, that made me happier. But you got to pay your dues. You got to learn your craft, and it takes a while to get there. And it's hard. And what we do for a living, Sam, I know you agree, it's hard.
You have to love it, I think, to practice family law. I truly believe that, which we do. When you went to law school, what was it like? What was the environment like? How many men and women were there actually in your class?
So when I went to college, women were a quarter of the population. Law school, I think we were a third of the population. And most of the women who wanted to have a family and work and et cetera, we all sort of globbed together. But I was used to that. So yeah, even though the more guys than girls, that's just what I was used to in college and law school. And I had my friends and I had my guy friends and I just chucked along. I have watched firms and businesses dramatically change on how women were treated. And I remember through my career being treated differently, being hit on, having people say inappropriate things to me, opposing counsels, people who interviewed me, things I wouldn't say on TV, so to speak. I mean, it was horrible, scandalous, but you just smile and you go on. Did I deal with it? Yes. But that's just the way it was. And it's a lot better now. Thank God.
Specifically, let's unpack that a little bit. Specifically, going into court, how was it different being a woman when you started?
Well, I remember when I clerked in the federal courthouse, there was one magistrate who literally would tell women what they were allowed to wear and not wear. He would throw women out of his court for acting a certain way or dressing a certain way. Now, I didn't have experience in front of that magistrate. My judge was not like that, but that was the talk of the courthouse, and that was not unusual. And having guys, talk about their golf game, lawyers and judges, it was a boys' network, but that was what I was used to. So I just kept pushing and plugged along and tried to use it to my advantage as best I could.
I imagine it taught you a little bit about resilience as well. Since you started practicing, what are the biggest changes for women in the area?
In family law or as lawyers?
Both.
Well, it's wonderful to see in big law firms that there are women who are at the head of the firm around the world, prime ministers, presidents. We haven't had that yet as a country. Family law, interesting. When I was coming up the ranks, and Sam, you and I talked about this, there were primarily 2 women who were the most prominent of the top flight lawyers. The rest were all men. And I had a discussion after I opposed Dennis Wasser, your former boss, in a trial. We shared a wall and we were opposing counsel. And he gave me my report card after our trial. And he started to give me criticism. And I said, Dennis, step back for a second. I don't have a role model. I am not. And I named each of these women. And he looked at me and he said, you're right. And I said, I look up to you. I admire you, but I can't be you. And I can't be them. I'm trying to figure out who I am and how I do it, which is one of the reasons why I am thrilled to see so many women who are in leadership positions in the family law bar. And when I say leadership in firms, I don't mean within the Bar Association. I mean within firms, people you look up to. I mean, look at you, Sam. You're heading up your department in an international firm. God bless. And that's hard to do. 30 years ago, not sure you could have done that. As great as you are, you couldn't have done that. So for me, I ultimately started my own practice. But truth be told, if I were a guy running my practice, I would have been treated with more respect than I was a woman running my practice. That's
So,
the reality.
you mentioned two of them. Let's actually name check those. Who were those women that you looked at as kind of your role models at the time when you were coming up?
That was my point. I didn't have them. Who were the leaders in the bar?
Yeah,
at that
who are those
point?
leaders? Yeah.
Dennis Wasser, Joe Tabak, Jerry Goldberg, although at this point he was deceased. I'm even trying to remember. Steve Kalabny.
I meant the leading women, the two leading women that you mentioned.
Arlene Coleman Schwimmer and Marianne LaGuardia.
Yeah. So, but you did learn, like you said, you were learning from Dennis. You shared a wall with Dennis, and even earlier on, as a young attorney, you were working for Dan and with Dan.
I was about to say
Bruce, right? Yeah. So let's
Dan
talk
Jaffe
a little.
and Bruce Clemens were the top of the bar.
Very good friends of the program here with us. And so let's talk a little bit about that time, that first push into family law. First, I guess, really more importantly, how did you find the passion for family law? How did you know that was the path that you wanted to go down? You got to love it, right? We talked about that. So where did you get that love from? And then we'll talk about Dan and Bruce.
Okay, I was going to do it the other way around. Is that okay?
Well, do whatever you want. Do whatever you want.
So,
yeah.
The reason I didn't include Dan and Bruce in that conversation is because Dan and Bruce were my bosses, and I made a very conscious choice. I was a lawyer at Wyman Boutzer, which is now Glazer Weil and Cat Muchin. I made a conscious choice when I left Wyman because I really wanted people to teach me. I was doing family law at Wyman. I had 16 terrific partners who were great lawyers, but they didn't know family law. When I had a set of interrogatories to draft, I'd call people in my study group. I was clueless. I was trying to learn. And lucky for me, I had appeared in front of Judge Ken Black, who liked me, and he picked up the phone. And he called Jerry Goldberg, and he called Bruce and Dan. And I had 6 different job offers, and I picked Jaffe and Clemens that paid the least because I thought I would get the best training and the best environment. And I did. Dan and Bruce are terrific lawyers and terrific people, and I learned a lot. Ultimately, and I remember Dan saying this to my parents. I don't remember saying it, but I have to believe I said it, that I said to him, they're employers and employees, and I'm an employer. I remember when I started my own firm, I was terrified, like, who am I? It would never have occurred to me to do that. Bruce encouraged me. He encouraged me with a different business model that he didn't train me to handle, which were smaller cases. I don't know how to do that. He didn't train me on that. Dan didn't train me. But ultimately, that became my passion to build something. My belief is I'm willing to take risks and fail. I am not willing not to take a risk and not move forward. So how did I get into family law in the very beginning? That's also what you asked. When I was growing up, one of my dad's partners wrote the equitable distribution statute. She was the diva, the queen of matrimonial law in New York. And she used to say to me, don't become a divorce lawyer, or a matrimonial lawyer, she would call it. And I didn't want that emotional responsibility, nor did I want to be a criminal lawyer because I didn't want that emotional responsibility. So fast forward, I'm in my second year at Columbia Law School, and you get to take one elective, at least when I was in school. They could have called it white shirt law. I'm looking at your shirt. I didn't care what it was, as long as I could actually do something. And in this case, it was a family law class, which was taught by 4 professors, a regular professor, a tax professor, a social worker, and a psychiatrist. And there was a workshop. And this is the key part. I would draft, I would negotiate, and I went through a mock trial. So that's what I wanted. Fast forward, the exam in the big lecture class was, here's 12 questions, prepare them. You can come in with notes. We're going to pick 6. So I was in the stacks. I don't know if they even call them that anymore, in the library, and I was preparing, and I wanted a break. It's not like they had Vogue magazine lying around. So I was wandering around the stacks, and I pulled off the shelf, which lawyers this generation don't know. We had books, and once a year, they would take the cases that were published and put them in a hardbound book. But quarterly, they would put them in this butter yellow softbound book. So I pulled one off the shelf, and I was looking like a book, short stories, and I come across a case, and all the you family law lawyers There's Moore, one was Moore and one is Marston. It is like Miranda to a criminal lawyer, just by chance. And it had the fact pattern of one of the questions of the 12 that was given to me. There was a property in New York in one person's name, but joint money went into it, and a property in California in both parties' name, but one party's money went into it. What do? And these cases analyzed the law. Well, I got lucky. Yeah, somebody up there was looking down at me. It's not like I used my brain. I found this case. And that was one of the questions on the exam, because as it turned out, I figured it out. The main professor had been an associate out here at Tuttle and Taylor. So he was finding cases in family law that were new and current. And that was, since then, it's been codified. That's what we deal with. That's our bookend. And I ended up with apparently the highest grade in the class. And at the time at Columbia, if you had the highest grade on the exam or the class, the professor wrote you a letter. So I had 4 professors. So I got this really fat envelope, and I was a summer clerk out here at Loeb and Loeb. And I get this really fat envelope, and I think I'm being kicked out of school. I was terrified. And I had professors asking me if I could do research for them, other professors asking if I could be on task force. And I realized I could have a client with a heartbeat, not just a litigation budget, which sometimes would be nice. And sort of the rest is history. And it is something that I have a national feeling for, talking to people, dealing with people. And one thing I can say that not every lawyer can say is, what we do for a living, we make a difference, bar none.
We talked briefly about Dennis Wasser, you talked about Dan Jaffe, you talked about a few others. Can you point to anything in your career that they really helped you develop or helped you hone your skills to become the lawyer you have become and the force you've become today and have been for quite some time? Okay,
I'll pick Dennis, Dan, and Bruce. Dennis, the way he held himself, the way he examined and cross-examined a witness. We did trials together on the same side, and he was really facile and had a certain class, etc. Really smart, quick to understand. Dan, I remember second chairing a trial with him when I was a baby lawyer, and he gave his opening and he sat down and he looked at me and he said, "How'd I do?" And I looked at him like, "You were wonderful. I mean, you're asking me?" He said, "If I take for granted how I did, I should take down my shingle." I also saw that he was involved in the bar. They were all leaders. He was an incredibly quick study and a lot of charisma. Bruce was dogged, organized, ran a great firm. God bless him for Dan. Really dug and taught me how to do that. And so I had, people that I could look up to, but I couldn't be them. And I also remember I had a case that I had originated in front of Judge Black. And he said, "Okay, bring the kids down at 1:30. So I called Bill Ryden, who was a partner then, and I said, I've never done this. I'm, a 3-year out lawyer, 2-year out lawyer. He said, "I've never done it. Bruce has never done it. Dan's never done it." But he came down and held my hand, and we did what we needed to do. And I had that ability, to do that and learn from some of the best. I'm very grateful, and I've tried to pay it forward.
So you talked about it. You eventually had to go out. You hung your own shingle, and you were a builder, right? You said you wanted to be a builder. You are a builder. When did you know it was the right time to do? I mean, it's never exactly the right time, but when did you know you had to take that step? And what would you tell young associates or younger partners at a firm now to consider in their own lives and careers if they're weighing the risks and the challenges of going out on their own?
Well, you have to know yourself and what your comfort level is. There are many people who could not fathom being a leader or being on their own. They like the comfort of others making the decision, and they can rise as far as they want or are able to within that structure. I didn't realize that I had that in me because I came from, a big firm. My grandfather founded Phillips Kniser. My father worked with a partner there and was an executive at United Artists. So I always thought of, sort of big companies, big firms. And when I was at Wyman, I went to Jaffe and Clemens because I really wanted to learn. And there came a point where I realized that what I wanted for my future didn't match what Bruce and Dan wanted. It was their firm. And they, other than Bill, they rarely weren't taking partners. And they have every right to make that decision. And that model worked great for them. Eventually that changed, but still it was their firm. And I figured, this was the time my son had just been born. I literally opened my firm 2 weeks after my son's first birthday. And I had to leave a trial for his second birthday. It was a challenge, and I didn't have a lot of colleagues or role models out there who were doing the same thing. And that's what I meant by role models of having a family, being a woman. I have my own style. I'm not always pedal to the metal. I evaluate it. I talk about this in my book, Divorce, It's All About Control, How to Win the Emotional, Psychological, and Legal Wars. I see myself as a partner to my client. I don't pat them on the head and say, dear, dear, dearie, I'll call you in 6 months, or here's a letter, tell me what you want me to do. I'm evaluative, I'm analytical, I educate, I tell clients what I think, but ultimately it's their decision and we have to partner together. And so I had to figure out how I could do that, where I could do that. Did I have enough guts to try it on my own? And I did, and I took a huge pay cut, but it was the best financial decision of my career and psychologically the best decision. But then there came a time where I don't want to do that anymore. And 7 years ago, July 1, I moved my firm to Blank Rome, which has been an incredibly supportive, wonderful place. We have 20-something matrimonial lawyers in New York. We have 2 in Florida, 2 in Philly. We started our group here. Christina Royce, Ashley Silberfeld, Glenn Bazar, they all came over, and we're building out here. Sam knows what that is because she started over at Withers. And it's good to be back in a firm where the copier and the insurance and how to deal with COVID was decided by somebody else.
So to keep going on this, there is a women's equity piece of this for you and what you do in terms of putting together a summit. Can you talk to us a little bit about your women's summit? Because it did take place last week and I've heard it was fantastic.
It was fantastic. So let me tell you how it came about. I joined the firm in 2016, July 1. We physically moved into the firm on August 1. In October, I went back east to DC and Philly and New York to meet a bunch more of my partners. And I started in DC and I met with one of my female partners and a male partner. And we bonded because we knew people in common, a client of hers that I had worked with in a case. And then I met with another female partner, and then I met with a third female partner. And I realized that, oh my God, I have peers across the firm. In the LA office, I was the most senior woman partner. The second in terms of seniority could have been my daughter and everybody else below her. And so I really wanted to get to know my female partners. So at lunch, I was having lunch with our head of business development and marketing. And I had this idea of having a women's retreat, which we then developed into, and I stood fast by this, that the first day, night, whatever, would be just the women partners. Because how can we refer to each other or sell if we didn't know each other? And then we brought the female clients in. And he greenlit it, went to the then managing partner chair of the firm, he greenlit it. If those 2 men did not do that, we wouldn't have had it. This was our 7th. It's been a game changer. It has enabled the women to seriously increase books of business, get to know clients better, embed with clients. I don't mean in bed, but embed with clients, develop relationships, and most importantly, really, really know each other. Excuse me.
I think that's a great lead into one of our last questions, because I think you've told such an amazing story and we've touched on so many different issues. If we could really boil it down, what would you want your legacy to be in the family law community, or maybe more broadly, for when I interview Sam again 20 years from now and she talks about Stacy? What do you want her to say?
That I encourage people in words and action to develop their fullest potential. Did that with people in my law firm. I would have Friday meetings with anybody who wanted to come to help them develop business. You want to get on a board? Tell me, I'll get you on a board. You want to write an article? Tell me, I'll help you write an article. I'll find a place to publish it. You want to speak? Tell me, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a partner? Do you not want to be a partner? Do you want to go to court? Do you not want to go to court? Then take it to blank room. Okay, let's take that at a grander level, but you have to find it organically. And I've met with and spent a lot of time with many of the folks that I mentor at Blank Rome, where they couldn't figure out how to go about it because they were trying to do it the boys' way. They didn't play golf. They did go to bars. How are they going to do it? And we would talk it through and they would find their organic way of doing it, and knowing that somebody supported them and cheered them on. And that's why I'm so proud of Sam. I'm like, look at what she's done. And I remember when she just started. So God bless. And that's what I want my legacy to be. I want to change people's lives, not just our clients, but people I work with.
You know, Stacy, you've touched on the fact that I've known you my entire career, and it made this conversation and with you today and in our preparation for today that much more interesting to me, because there's always new things and that you learn about people if you just take a second to listen and you're open-minded and you really hear it, because we gain so much experience over time and it's happening constantly. You're not the same person you were a month ago or 2 months ago, right? And that evolution. And so for me, this conversation is actually, both of our conversations have been absolutely phenomenal. And I truly appreciate this being the episode I got to help with. But giving yourself advice, one last piece of advice to yourself about when you, at the end of the day, what would you tell your younger self about practicing law and where you ended up today?
Don't be so hard on yourself and keep your eyes open to change. Don't be afraid of taking risks, calculated risks, because as one of my clients taught me a long time ago, when you think you have lemons, you can make lemonade.
Bravo.
I love that. That's a classic for a reason.
It actually, the way he phrased it was, when you think a door is slammed in your face, or he said closed, there are other doors that will open. And that's what you need to do, whether in a case or for yourself. You know, we all have setbacks in cases, and then you got to pivot and figure out, okay, how to do it. And that's what makes us good at what we do, because as I said to one judge many years ago, when I picked an expert that he wasn't used to seeing, he said, we don't normally do it that way. And I said, if I am hired just to be a cookie cutter, which I'm not, then I'm taking down my shingle. I want to think outside the box. That's how you succeed. That's how you help people. So that's my mantra.
And we should all listen to it, and it's 100% correct. Stacy, thank you so much for joining us today and for sharing with us about your personal experience and for opening up to us about your second divorce. It was very meaningful, and there's a lot we can all learn from it in our practices and in our lives. So I think it's even that much more important. Greatly appreciate it. So that wraps up today's episode. Please mark your calendars now and join us for our next episodes, all at 12:30 p.m. on the first Wednesday of each month. Next month, we have Grace Jamra and Mike Hanasab, followed by Aaron Gray and Chelsea Stevens, and then Judge Silberman. Thank you, Jenna, Leslie, and Belinda at the bar, the Family Law Executive Committee led by Aaron Gray and Chelsea Stevens, and of course, our section sponsors. Most importantly, thank you, Stacy, for being here, and thank you, Dan, for letting me join you in this great adventure.
Thank you both, guys. This was a blast.
Thank you.
See everybody next month.